The Red River's Song. The heavy humidity clung to On's skin as she walked through the narrow alleyways of Hanoi. It was late, and the streets were quieter than usual, a low, murmuring stillness hanging in the air. The bustle of the day had faded into the night, but the city never truly slept. The faint smell of pho wafted through the air, mingling with the earthiness of wet stone and the gasoline exhaust of scooters weaving past. On didn't like the quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence you could complain about. It was simply the way things were now, after the war that never truly ended. As a child, she'd heard the stories, the ones whispered late at night by her grandmother, with the lanterns flickering on the edges of their village. Stories about spirits, restless souls, and the horrors that followed the war, the ones that couldn't leave, no matter how much time passed. On had grown up thinking they were just stories, dark fairy tales meant to scare children. But now, living in the city, she wasn't so sure. She turned a corner onto a street she didn't remember walking down before. A chill slid down her spine. The light from the nearby shop signs flickered oddly, casting sharp shadows that seemed to dance in the corners of her vision. The night air grew colder, and On could hear the faint hum of the river nearby, though it should have been farther off. And then, she saw it. A man was standing by the riverbank, his back turned to her. He wore a black, tattered military uniform that seemed out of place, as if it belonged to a time long past. His posture was stiff, unnatural, as though he was caught in some invisible wind, unable to move. But the thing that froze On's heart was the sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like a low, mourning song that rose from his chest. It was a lullaby, the kind On's mother had once sung to her when she was little. She stood still, unable to move, as the figure began to sway slightly. His hand reached out toward the river, and On could hear the whispers now, voices rising from the water, deep and mournful, as if something beneath the surface was calling him home. For a moment, everything seemed to blur. The man, the river, the shadows around her, all merged into one pulsating, strange thing. The lullaby stopped abruptly, and the man's body jerked violently, his neck snapping unnaturally. His head twisted all the way around to face her. His eyes, wide, bloodshot, and hollow, glared at her, not with anger, but with something much worse, an empty, sorrowful hunger. On's heart hammered in her chest. She turned, her feet moving before she could even think, and ran, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. But the alleyways didn't seem to lead her back home. They twisted and looped around her, forcing her deeper into the city. The voices from the river followed her, growing louder, their eerie song threading through the cracks of her mind. Her feet stumbled over the uneven pavement, but the rhythm of her pulse and the haunting tune were louder than everything else. She passed a woman selling flowers on the street corner. Her eyes were glassy, and her hands moved in slow, deliberate motions, arranging the flowers without ever looking at them. The woman's lips moved, repeating something under her breath. On's heart skipped as she realized the woman was singing the same lullaby, the same one the man had been humming at the river. On wanted to run, to scream, but her legs felt like stone. The city, the air, the very streets seemed to be closing in on her, pressing her towards something she couldn't see. Then, she turned another corner and stumbled into the open courtyard of an old building. The walls were covered in moss, and the ground was wet, the echoes of her footsteps seeming to vibrate unnaturally. In the center of the courtyard stood an old statue, worn and broken with age. On's eyes lingered on it, the stone figure of a soldier, his rifle held close, his face weathered and cracked. His eyes, empty, like the man by the river, seemed to follow her. The wind picked up around her, the air thickening with the smell of decay, and the faint sound of the lullaby grew louder. A voice, deep and raw, broke through the melody. "You shouldn't have come here." On spun around. The man from the river stood there now, his form more solid, more real, though still as ghostly. His face was covered in dark scars, as if burned by fire. His lips were cracked and dry, and he stretched out a trembling hand toward her. "You've disturbed it." On tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat constricted, as if the air around her had solidified into stone. She backed away, but the man took a step forward, and his shadow stretched impossibly long, swallowing the ground beneath his feet. "You can't leave now." Behind him, the statue of the soldier began to move, its stone limbs cracking and grinding as it slowly came to life. Its once stoic face twisted into a grimace of agony, and it raised its rifle, pointing it directly at On. Her body froze, her mind screaming, but her legs could not move. "You must stay," the man whispered, his voice no longer the mournful lullaby, but something worse, a harsh rasp, like the scraping of stone against stone. "The river never forgets. Neither do we." Before she could react, the statue lunged forward, its hands outstretched to grab her, its stone fingers digging into her flesh. On's world exploded into blinding pain. The last thing she saw was the face of the soldier, his hollow eyes staring into hers. Then, nothing. Days later, a fisherman along the Red River found On's body, strange, still, and stiff as if frozen in time. Her face was calm, eerily peaceful, but her eyes were wide open, staring into the dark, rushing waters of the river. The fisherman later swore he heard a faint lullaby in the distance, floating on the breeze, coming from the depths of the river. And those who passed by the old statue in the courtyard said it had moved again. But this time, its gaze was not just stone, it was alive, and the statue's rifle was no longer empty. It was aimed at whoever dared to listen to the song of the dead.